We're recording.
Okay. You know, the evil demons are sabotaging our equipment. What I was going to start with is that many of us think of our American system of jurisprudence being one of the best in the world. And yet when you study the Israeli or the old Jewish system of jurisprudence, in some respects, it was more of a fair and more of justice system than the system that we have today. And when we talk about tonight, we're going to talk about the three Jewish trials of Jesus. And these are the trials that Jesus had before he was turned over to the Romans to carry out the sentence that the Jewish leaders wanted, and that is the death of Jesus. And when we look at this system of laws, civil procedure, criminal procedure, due process that was followed in ancient Israel, we're going to find that it's really a remarkable system. And the reason I'm going to spend some time on the system of justice in Jesus' time is because while most of us, if asked the question, did Jesus have a fair trial, we'd say no. But you really don't know the depth of how unfair and how illegal the hearings were that Jesus was attended. And so we're going to spend some time going into detail about it. Now, we've been studying Jesus' intercessory prayer before Jesus was arrested and taken away from his disciples. And we talked about the three parts of that prayer where Jesus prayed for himself, that he would be restored to glory that God, he shared with God before the beginning of creation. Then he prayed for the disciples that were with him on that Thursday evening. And then he prayed for the future disciples that God would call to be his own. Then we talked about after Jesus concluded his prayer, he and his disciples went up the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he and three of his disciples, Peter, John, and James, went into the garden. Jesus went further into the garden where he prayed. And this is the prayer where he was tempted by Satan to abandon the will of God, where he bled tears of blood, and where he really agonized, not so much about the physical torture that he knew he was going to face, but the wrath of God that he would bear on the cross, bearing the sins for all mankind. And Jesus concluded the prayer that God's will, not his own, that even though he had asked for God to have the cup pass. At the conclusion of Jesus's prayer, he went back to the three disciples that had entered into the garden with him, and for the third time found them asleep. He basically told them to wake up, and then the soldiers, palace guards, and officials led by Judas came into the garden, and Jesus was arrested. And we focused on Jesus' arrest by the armed soldiers and officials sent by the high priests and Pharisees, who were led into the garden by Judas, who had betrayed Jesus. And we concluded from last week's lesson that Jesus purposely allowed himself to be arrested in order to fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament and God's will. Now, this week, we're going to start our two-part lesson of the 6 hearings which took place before Jesus was taken to the Roman authorities and then crucified. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that having already decided that Jesus needed to be put to death, the Jewish leaders abandoned all notions of justice, due process, and jurisprudence, and simply looked for a basis to justify taking Jesus to the Roman authorities to take the life of an innocent man. So we're going to go into and outline this. The Jewish authorities did not follow Jewish law, due process, or rules of procedure to determine the basis for having Jesus put to death. We're going to go through first a summary of the Jewish system of justice, due process, and rules of procedure. Then we're going to talk and focus on Jesus' arraignment before the high priest Annas. Then we're going to talk about Jesus's trial before the high priest Caiaphas and the entire body of Sanhedrin. Then we're going to talk a real quick focus on Peter's denials of being associated with Jesus. And then we're going to conclude with Jesus' appearance at the early morning show trial before the Sanhedrin. And then we'll get into our discussion questions. So the study itself is the Jewish authorities did not follow Jewish law, due process, or rules of procedure to determine the basis for having Jesus put to death. So let's summarize what the systems of justice and jurisprudence was in Jesus' time for capital offenses. Capital offenses being those offenses where the death penalty is imposed. Now, the establishment of the Jewish system of justice goes back to the instructions in Deuteronomy, which God gave to Moses before the second generation of the Jews of the Exodus entered into the promised land. The guidance and instructions which God gave to Moses emphasized the need for the Jewish people to dispense both justice and mercy in their judicial proceedings. In Deuteronomy 16, verses 18 through 20, God instructed Moses as follows: appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall judge the people fairly. Do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. What would you expect from our Lord? Our Lord is a Lord of justice, of righteousness, and he expected Israel to be an example to the rest of the world. And so he provided the Israelites that were going into the promised land a system of justice that would both be impose justice, but also mercy and fairness. So both civil and criminal matters were brought before local tribunals composed of the elders or heads of the tribes. If you remember when we studied Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and we noted that the judicial system went through the heads of the clans, heads of the tribes, and these heads would determine the guilt or innocence of whoever was brought to them before them, and they handled both civil and criminal matters. In towns where there are at least 120 men who were heads of the tribal clans, only 23 were appointed as a council or Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is a word that was used throughout Israel, not just for the Sanhedrin, which was the 70 in Jerusalem. And literally it is translated as sitting together. These Sanhedrins, or these 23 heads of the family clans, then acted as the judges and triers of fact. Now, in our judicial system, we have a judge that is impartial, and then we have a prosecutor, and we have a defense attorney, and then the judge can act as a jury or the trier of fact, or you can request in a criminal case a sitting jury of 12. So in Israel, ancient Israel, these 23 heads of the tribal clans, the Sanhedrin, acted both as judge and trier of fact. So they had the dual capacity. Now, the tribunal of 23 were required to act impartially to promote both justice and mercy. Now, in towns where there are less than 120 men who are heads of the tribal clans, the council or Sanhedrin would be comprised of as few as 3 or 7 heads or elders who would act as the judges and triers of fact. In larger towns, there could be several tribunals and even regional tribunals. In Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin was the ruling body or council of the Jewish people. It was comprised of 70 members plus the high priest. The Sanhedrin consisted of 24 Pharisees, 24 Sadducees, and 22 other priests and elders, and were considered as the supreme court of the Jewish judicial system. So they not only governed the Jewish people, but they also were the highest court of the Jewish people, and they heard matters in Jerusalem. And now, even though there were 70, in order to be a judge and a trier of a case, they only needed 23 of the members of the Sanhedrin to hear a case. Now, the rules of procedure and due process were designed to promote, again, these words, justice and mercy. At a minimum, there are three requirements. The first requirement was a public trial, a trial which could only be conducted in the daytime, subject to the open scrutiny of the entire community.
Right.
That's critical, and we follow that practice here. Our trials are open to the public. One of the current controversies is whether it should be televised or not, and in most cases, judges defer to having trials where there's a large public interest on TV, so you can watch the proceedings on TV. The second major requirement was a defense for the accused, where an advocate would be appointed to speak for or on behalf of the accused, and witnesses were called by the defense to testify. In other words, when the trial was started, the accused knew what charges were against him. There used to, in front of the trier of fact, or the judges, the 23 members that were to be the judges and triers of fact, there were people that recorded the proceedings. And many times these were people that aspired to be on the Sanhedrin. And these people, one of them or more than one of them, would be appointed or designated to act on behalf of the accused. Now, in capital or death penalty cases, the guilt of an accused required corroboration by at least 2 or 3 witnesses. In Deuteronomy 17, verses 6 and 7, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a man shall be put to death, but no one shall be put to death on the testimony of only 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting him to death, and then the hands of all people. So you had to have 2 or more witnesses that corroborate the guilt of the person that's accused. These same 2 people, if there was a conviction, they would be the first to be led out to the place of execution, and they would be the first to pick up stones and throw them at the accused to execute the sentence. So imagine if you're a witness against somebody, you know that if he's convicted, you're going to be one of the first people to cast the first stones. When Jesus was talking about the woman caught in adultery and said, he who without sin cast the first stones, he was talking about those that were witnesses to the adultery of this woman cast the first stone, because that's how the executions were carried out, by the accusing witnesses first and then the rest of the tribes. An accused cannot be questioned or compelled to testify against himself. There was no self-incrimination, and his statements were insufficient to render a guilty verdict. The primary obligation of the tribunal was to dispense justice. In order to dispense justice, the tribunal enacted procedures to determine the truth. Before a witness was called to testify in death penalty cases, the president of the tribunal would give the following admonishment. It is not conjectures or whatever public rumor has brought you that we ask of you. Consider that a great responsibility rests upon you as a witness. We are not occupied by an affair like a case of pecuniary interest in which an injury may be repaired. If you cause the condemnation of a person unjustly accused, his blood and the blood of all the posterity of that person of whom you will deprive the earth will fall upon you. God will demand of you an account as he demanded an account by Cain about the blood of Abel. Now speak. Boy, that's a harsher admonition than what we say in courts today, where we just sit there say, do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? It used to say, so help me God, but that's been eliminated from our court proceedings. So think of that admonition that is given by the president before each witness against the accused is allowed to testify. In addition, in a capital case, a minimum of 3 days were required to conclude the matter. The first day was the day of trial, where the evidence against the accused was presented and the matters of defense were presented. After the conclusion of the evidence, a summary of the evidence was given, and 2 scribes were designated to record the vote of the council. 1 scribe recorded the votes for conviction, the other the votes for acquittal. It took 11 votes to acquit and 13 to convict. If the votes to convict were unanimous, the accused was immediately released because of a, okay, if the conviction were unanimous, the accused was immediately released because a unanimous vote displayed a complete lack of mercy and due consideration by the tribunal. So if 23 of the members of the tribunal said guilty, the accused was acquitted and was able to walk free, because there's mercy that's built into the law. And if you never get 100% certainty that somebody's guilty of a crime. And so when they had a unanimous vote, it was determined that it wasn't a fair trial. Now, the second day, or the next day, was an intermediate day between the trial and the execution of the convicted prisoner. It was a day where the members of the tribunal fasted, refrained from drinking alcohol, and pondered and reconsidered the evidence against the accused. It also allowed an opportunity for other matters or evidence to be brought to the attention of the members of the tribunal. On the third day, the tribunal reconvened, and those who voted for conviction were given an opportunity to change their vote to a vote for acquittal. Those members of the tribunal who voted for acquittal could not change their votes. If conviction stood, more than 13 members of the tribal still voted for the conviction. The members of the tribunal remained in their seats while the prisoner was led out of the courtroom to his place of execution. 3 officials were designated to accompany the convicted prisoner. One who followed the prisoner on a horse, another to trail behind with a white flag to stop the proceedings if anything came up, and the horse to take the prisoner back to the council that remained in their seats. And then a third was a herald that, as they proceeded to the place of execution, would shout out, "This is the name of the person that's been convicted of this crime. These are the 2 people, the names of the 2 people that accused him. If anybody has any evidence or any matters that pertain to the proceeding, please say so now." And this was done throughout. The prisoner himself had 5 independent opportunities to say, "I forgot something. I needed to add more. There's something else I should say." Anytime that he indicated that he had something else to add, the horse took him back to the tribunal and he was allowed to present that evidence. Only after all of this, when he reached the place of execution, did the 2 that accused him, the 2 or 3 accused him, pick up the stones and cast them at the convicted prisoner. The prisoner, before he was the execution of the sentence, he was given the opportunity to confess of his crime. Now he's fully convicted. He's about to be executed. If he confesses, then they would give him a solution so that he would not feel the pain of being stoned to death. So that's the judicial system. And boy, I can tell you, there's a lot of opportunities to revisit the evidence to determine that they're not convicting an innocent man. When the execution of this started, again, the accusing witnesses who testified against the convicted prisoner were required to cast the first stones to take the prisoner's life. Capital offense trials could not be conducted on the eve of a feast or during the feast itself, as the occurrence of a feast would distract the members of the tribunal and pressure them to expedite the hearing, and witnesses may not be willing or available to testify because they may be participating in the feast. So that's the overall system of justice that was in place at the time of Jesus. So let's get into the accounts of Jesus's appearances before the Jewish tribunals. Now, there were 6 different hearings against Jesus. 3 of the hearings were before the Jewish high priests, Annas and Caiaphas, and the Sanhedrin, who were the judges and triers of fact. These 3 hearings were conducted to determine what crime Jesus should be charged with and convicted of so that Jesus could be put to death. That is against Jewish law. In Jewish law, they knew what the crime was. They arrested the person. They brought him before the tribunal. In Jesus's case, when Jesus was arrested, they had no idea what crime Jesus committed, and we're going to get into that. The other 3 hearings were conducted before Roman authorities, Pilate and Herod. The only issue to be decided by the Roman authorities is whether or not the Romans would decide to have Jesus crucified. The Jewish leaders and the tribunal that convicted Jesus, they went to the Roman authorities because the Roman authorities had taken away the ability of the Jewish people to impose the death sentence. So their job before the Roman authorities was to persuade the Romans that Jesus needed to be executed. And it was up to the Roman authorities to either execute Jesus or not. Obviously, they would look to see whether or not Jesus broke any Roman law. They would consider whether they broke Jewish law, but in most cases, as we're going to see in the case of Jesus, they had other reasons for deciding to execute Jesus. So where did this start? When Jesus was arrested in the garden by these guards, he is bound and then immediately taken before the former high priest Annas at Annas's house. The John 18 verses 12 through 14 and 19 through 23 describe this first appearance of Jesus before the high priest Annas. And it says, then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and they brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was one who advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus responded, I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby struck Jesus in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas the high priest. That's the first appearance or first hearing of Jesus. When Jesus was arrested and taken to Annas, no criminal charges had been made against Jesus. Essentially, this first appearance was equivalent to an arraignment where under our law, the charges against the accused are formally presented to the accused. However, in this case, there were no pending charges, and Annas was required to determine what crime, if any, that Jesus had committed in order for him to be sentenced to death. Jesus was first taken to Annas because Annas was still considered as the most powerful of the family of priests, even though he had not served as a high priest for more than 20 years. Under Jewish law, high priests were appointed to serve for life. But in order to prevent any one high priest from accumulating too much power and wealth, the Roman authorities required the position of the high priest to be changed on a regular basis. Annas had 5 sons who replaced him as the high priest. And after he ran out of sons to take his place, his son-in-law, Caiaphas, was appointed as the high priest. So basically, the Romans told Annas that he could no longer be the high priest, but Annas selected his sons first and ultimately his son-in-law to be the high priest instead of him. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, Annas and his family of priests were detested by the Jewish people because they were considered as a family of racketeers who unjustly profited from the people. And Annas was considered the godfather of the criminal enterprise. Annas and his family members profited from charging excessive exchange rates charged for the Jewish people to exchange their coinage into the temple shekel, which was charged to enter the temple complex and to pay the annual temple tax. They also charged excessive fees for the Jewish people to purchase unblemished animals to sacrifice at the temple. If they brought their own animal to sacrifice, members of Annas's criminal enterprise would say that the animal was blemished and they had refused to accept the animal as suitable for sacrifice and require the people to purchase an animal raised under the supervision of the priesthood. In other words, you couldn't bring your own animal, even if it was perfect, because they would say it wasn't perfect, and they'd force you to buy their high, overpriced animal that may be more blemished than the one you brought. The Jews resented these criminal activities and referred to the temple money changers and the merchants selling approved animals for sacrifice as Annas's bazaar. When Jesus appeared before Annas, Annas questioned Jesus, hoping that Jesus would say or reveal something which could be used as a basis for a capital offense, which would subject Jesus to be put to death by the Roman authorities. In other words, he went fishing and he was asking Jesus, what he had spoken about, who were his disciples. He was looking for some crime to attach to Jesus. Annas and the Sanhedrin had already decided that Jesus needed to be put to death, but they still needed a justification which they could take to the Romans who held the authority to dispense the death penalty. Annas's question of Jesus about who were his disciples and what Jesus had been teaching showed that Annas was uninformed, out of touch, and did not really know what Jesus was actually teaching. Annas's question of Jesus was illegal because there was a prohibition against self-incrimination, and any capital offense prosecution of an accused required testimony from at least 2 witnesses. Notice how Jesus responded to Annas. By responding to Annas that everything that Jesus spoke about was spoken openly in the synagogues and at the temple to the Jewish people, and that Annas should ask the people who heard him speak to answer his question. Jesus was properly calling into question the requirement under Jewish law for Annas to call at least 2 witnesses to testify as to the supposed crime for which Jesus was being arrested. The Jewish people knew their law. They knew their legal system. And Jesus said, everything I said was in open public, in the synagogues, in the temple. Call witnesses that would say and tell you what I spoke. Don't ask me because I'm not required to incriminate myself. The guard who struck Jesus in the face was the first to physically abuse Jesus. Jesus was bound, but this is the first in the scripture where somebody struck Jesus in the face. After being struck in the face by the guard, Jesus challenged Annas to call witnesses to testify against him. Having no witnesses, Annas decided to hand Jesus over to his son-in-law, Caiaphas. So here Jesus is brought before Annas. There's no charges pending. Annas just trying to get Jesus to say something that he could say, aha, you committed this offense. Having no idea what Jesus was actually teaching, he just knew that Jesus needed to be put to death and that everybody wanted him put to death. Annas said basically, I don't know what to do. Send him to my son-in-law. He's a priest. And so he did send him to Caiaphas. The initial proceeding against Jesus by Annas as a high priest was entirely illegal. The proceeding took place about 1 a.m. at night. All legal proceedings needed to be in daytime. It took place at Annas's house in secret. It violated the open trial laws. Annas had no authority to conduct the proceeding. He was not a member of the tribunal. He was not a judge and trier of fact. He was a high priest that was retired. So Jesus could only be tried or heard by the tribunal. Annas's questioning of Jesus was illegal and violated the prohibition against self-incrimination. The proceeding took place on the eve of the Jewish feast of Passover. I could probably, if I really search, find 5 or 6 other illegal things about this proceeding, but I think those are the most important ones. This was a total illegal proceeding. Now we're going to go to the second hearing that Jesus had before the Jewish authorities. Jesus' trial before the high priest Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. In Matthew 26, 57 through 67, we get a good description of what happened during this second proceeding. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, with the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is the testimony? This testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. But I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. They spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you? So this was the actual trial that was held against Jesus. While Jesus was before Annas, Caiaphas called the Sanhedrin together at Caiaphas's house. This did not take in the place where the Sanhedrin assembled and governed the Jewish people. It was at Caiaphas's house. If you were in Jerusalem at this time, the house of the priests were around a courtyard. And so you had Anas's house, and then you had Caiaphas's house, and then you had other buildings and structures where the priests all lived. So basically, Jesus was taken out of Anas's house, crossed the courtyard to Caiaphas's house, and while Jesus was with Annas, then Caiaphas was calling the entire body of the Sanhedrin together, and they all came. Although only 23 members of the Sanhedrin were required, according to Mark 14:59, all 70 members of the Sanhedrin were present. The trial took place around 2 o'clock in the morning. During the proceeding, the officials scrambled to find witnesses to testify against Jesus. Those who came forward had nothing to offer or presented confusing, unreliable, and inconsistent statements to the members of the Sanhedrin. The two witnesses who did present testimony, which the high priest confronted Jesus about, distorted what Jesus had actually said, testifying that Jesus had stated that he would destroy the temple when Jesus actually said that he would destroy his body and that Jesus would raise or rebuild his body in 3 days. They distorted what Jesus had said. When witnesses were called to testify in a criminal or capital case, not only were they admonished by the president, there's no evidence that these witnesses were admonished, they're just scrambling to get anybody to come forward. They also had to answer 7 specific questions. What Sabbath year was the closest to the event? In what year of the Sabbath year did the event take place? In what month of the Sabbath year did the event take place? In what hour of the Sabbath year did it take place? And then where did it take place? And exactly what was the offense that they observed? Those 7 things. It was very difficult to get 2 witnesses to say the same thing with those 7 questions. I know that whenever you get in cross-examination, you have 2 witnesses and they talk about an event, they get the times mixed up. They get the circumstances mixed up. But these 2 witnesses said that Jesus said at some time unspecified in the past that he was going to tear down the temple. And so that evidence wasn't very good. But what did Caiaphas do? He asked Jesus to respond to the testimony. Again, Jesus had no obligation to respond and testify against himself. Jesus remained silent. Frustrated by the fact that they had no witnesses, no credible witnesses, no corroborative witnesses to testify about any crime that Jesus had committed, the high priest Caiaphas cut to the chase and directly asked Jesus, "Are you saying that you're the Son of God?" Jesus responded, "I am. You say I am, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God in the heavens." So Jesus responded to that. Based upon Jesus's affirmation of his divinity and without the required testimony of 2 corroborating witnesses, the high priest charged Jesus with blasphemy and demanded the members of the Sanhedrin to decide his guilt. And as a group, the vote to convict Jesus of blasphemy was unanimous. The trial against Jesus was illegal and violated Jewish law and the rules of procedure. Again, it took place at night and in secret at Caiaphas's house. There were no witnesses who were able to testify about any crime committed by Jesus. No defense was allowed and no witnesses on behalf of Jesus were sought or asked to appear. The witnesses who were called were not properly admonished or questioned. They were not warned about giving false testimony, and they were not asked the required questions as to the exact time, place, and circumstances of the criminal act. The testimony of the 2 witnesses who testified about Jesus saying that he would destroy the temple did not establish any crime for which Jesus could be convicted. Jesus was improperly questioned to testify about himself. The trial took place on the eve of Passover and was concluded within hours of the first day of the trial, without an intervening day for the members of the Sanhedrin to review and ponder the evidence. Jesus was not immediately released upon the unanimous verdict of guilt by the members of the Sanhedrin. Nothing was said or done about the false testimony presented by the witnesses who appeared. Remember, they should have been admonished that if they testify falsely against an accused who's convicted of death, then they will bear the guilt of the person that they testified against. If the person was guilty and sentenced to death, the false witness would have been sentenced to death. Nothing happened to the witnesses that gave false testimony. The high priest and the members of the Sanhedrin had already decided that Jesus needed to be put to death and were never impartial judges and triers of fact. The fact that Jesus remained silent and did not respond to the two witnesses who testified against Jesus or to the case presented against him punctuated the frivolity, injustice, and lack of due process of the proceedings. Any response would have given some dignity or credibility to the proceedings. Jesus remained silent. So he did not want to give one iota of authenticity or credibility to the case against him by responding to it. It was garbage. There was no crime that was defined against Jesus, and he was convicted for blasphemy based upon a statement that he responded to when Caiaphas asked him, "Are you claiming that you're the Son of God?" And Jesus did answer that. Now, in answering that, Jesus focused on the fact that if he is going to be put to death, he's going to be put to death for claiming that he is the Son of God and nothing else. And that's important to know from these proceedings. Now we get to the point between the arraignment or the first hearing before the high priest Annas and the second trial before Caiaphas and the entire Sanhedrin. And this is where Peter's 3 denials of being associated with Jesus took place. In John 18, verses 15 through 18, and then again in 25 through 27, John writes, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because his disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" the girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire that they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. As Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the rooster began to crow. Peter leaves, crying and upset. There were 2 disciples that followed Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane to the courtyard of the priest. The first one was Simon Peter, who followed behind at a safe distance, kind of going back and forth, hiding in the shadows. And another disciple who is not named, but is identified as the disciple who knew the high priest. It's pretty clear that this second disciple was John, who is the son of Salome, a relative of Mary, Jesus's mother, who is related to Elizabeth, who was married to Zacharias, one of the priests who served in the temple. When we're talking about the community or family of the priests, they all would get together. They knew each other as priests, and then they knew their family members. John was related indirectly to one of the priests, Zacharias, and when he attended feasts and events, he was known to the high priest. So this disciple, this unnamed disciple, had to be John, because he was the only disciple who was related to any of the high priests and would be known by the high priest. It's also characteristic of John in writing his Gospels that he never named himself, the disciple who Jesus loved, or the unnamed disciple. So because of this, it's pretty clear that this disciple that followed Jesus along with the guards right into the courtyard, right into Annas's household, was a direct witness of all these proceedings that happened before Annas, before Caiaphas, and before the Sanhedrin. The disciple John followed Jesus right into the courtyard and witnessed the proceedings. Probably John disclosed this to the other writers of the Gospels, including Luke, whom clarified some of the things that John didn't clarify in his Gospel. Later, as Peter, it was John who arranged for Peter to be allowed into the courtyard. And the servant was just a slave girl. She was just opened the door. That's her job. And she says, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" And here a slave girl, Peter, in fear, denies that he's associated with Jesus. Later, as Peter was warming himself by the charcoal fire, he was asked by another servant if he was one of Jesus' disciples. And again, he denied it. An hour later, Peter was challenged by a third time by a relative of the man whose ear was cut off by the Peter in the garden, who identified Peter as being with Jesus in the garden. Peter denied it a third time, and the crow of the rooster happened a second time. Peter denied being with Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed twice, as Jesus prophesied. Ashamed, Peter ran away. Peter's first denial took place while Jesus was before Annas, and the other 2 denials took place as Peter was warming himself around the charcoal fire. The third time that Peter was challenged, Jesus was being taken from the house of Annas across the courtyard of the priest to the household of Caiaphas. This is when Jesus looked at Peter as Peter was denying him for the third time, and the rooster crowed a second time. So those are the first 2 hearings. The arraignment, no criminal charges. The trial, all these illegal procedures. Now we're going to get to Jesus's third appearance at the early morning show trial before the Sanhedrin. This is described by Luke in verses 66 through 71 of Luke 22 and verse 1 of chapter 23. At daybreak, the council of elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, the Sanhedrin, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Christ," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you the Son of God?" He replied, "You are right in saying I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We heard it from his own lips." Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. Notice that there are no legal proceedings against Jesus. They had already decided and convicted Jesus at that second trial at Caiaphas's house with all the Sanhedrin. This was just a show trial. This was just a pretense to show that they publicly decided to convict Jesus in daytime, open to the public in the place where the Sanhedrin met. But notice that they didn't do anything except saying, "Jesus, you say you're the Son of God." And Jesus responded, "You say I am, and I tell you I'm going to be sitting at the right hand of God in the heavens." That's all they asked him. They already knew the answer. This was a show trial. It meant nothing. It had nothing to do with his conviction. It was just to try and feebly satisfy the requirements of Jewish law. It was not an evidentiary hearing. It was held as a pretense to give the appearance that the Sanhedrin, as a tribunal of judges and triers of fact, were complying with Jewish law by conducting an open hearing during the daytime to convict Jesus and impose the death penalty to be carried out by the Roman authorities. Again, the Sanhedrin had already voted to convict Jesus of blasphemy, and at this show trial only asked Jesus to repeat the answer Jesus had given to Caiaphas earlier that morning. This third sham hearing was held approximately at 6:30 in the morning at the normal place where the Sanhedrin regularly met. So those are the 3 Jewish hearings. Pretty disgusting. You would have in our criminal law system writs of habeas corpus, a writ for a new trial, a motion for a declaration of a mistrial. You would have briefs that would talk about all the illegal things that the Sanhedrin and the priests did in bringing Jesus before them. This was a travesty of justice. As to the crime of blasphemy, If Jesus is the Son of God, he was telling the truth. Jesus was completely innocent. He was never charged or convicted of any criminal offense, and he was telling the truth about being the Son of God. He was a completely innocent man, convicted by a biased, hateful, non-judicial, illegal authority of the Jewish leaders. So I hope that this really gives you a bigger insight of how unfair, how unjust these tribunals were, and how they convicted a truly completely innocent man. Okay, so now we're going to get into the discussion questions. Before Jesus had been arrested, bound, and taken to the high priest, all of the Jewish leaders had already decided that Jesus needed to be put to death. The 3 hearings before the Jewish high priest and the Sanhedrin violated Jewish law, denied Jesus due process, and did not follow Jewish rules of procedure for capital or death penalty offenses. Jesus was never convicted of any criminal offense, but was, in quote, convicted of blasphemy because Jesus claimed that he was the Son of God and would soon sit on the right-hand side of the throne of God in heaven. Because what Jesus has said was true, Jesus was completely innocent. Jesus's response to the questions by the high priest and the Sanhedrin demonstrated Jesus's knowledge of Jewish law and his control over the proceedings against him. Jesus was never convicted of a criminal offense and channeled his accusers to make the determination that Jesus needed to be put to death solely on the basis that Jesus had claimed that he was God and not for any other reason. By narrowing the basis of the judgment against Jesus down to whether Jesus committed blasphemy, Jesus put in issue the truth of his claim, the issue which all men must decide in order to receive by grace the gift of salvation and eternal life.
Amen. Amen.
Okay.